Great pleasure to be here. And thank you very much for hosting me and for your kind introduction, Athanasios. I'm going to talk about realist theory and why I think realist theory is the best available theory for explaining how the world works. Let me just start by talking about theory and what theory is. When I was young and I would go to Washington and I tell people that I was interested in IR theory, they would say, theory is nice, but that's what you academics do. And what we do here in the real world is policy. We do policy, and policy and theory are two different worlds. And I would always say, I think you're fundamentally wrong. I think that there's no way that you can do policy without theory. This is my saying that I often use with students. Theory is God, and you want to understand that. And you cannot be a policymaker without theory. And I'll just tell you a quick story in that regard, and then I'll talk a little bit more about what theory is. I once won a book award at Georgetown University. It was for the tragedy of great power politics. And at the dinner, I sat next to Madeleine Albright, who was at that point the former Secretary of State. And she leaned over to me at one point in the evening and she said, you know, congratulations. And I think the kind of theoretical work that you do is interesting, but it's largely irrelevant in my world. And I said to her, I find it hard to believe that you would say that, because I said that you're one of the principal people I have on my syllabus from the policy world who shows evidence that theory permeates the thinking of policymakers. And I said there are three big liberal theories: economic interdependence theory, democratic peace theory, and liberal institutionalism. And I said, if you look carefully at all your writings, those theories are front and center in terms of how you think about the world. And I said, you are a fundamentally theoretical being. You just refuse to accept that. And you can kind of see the smoke coming out of her ears. She wasn't sure of what to make about that, but it was true. Theory is of enormous importance for policymakers, and I'll talk more about that as we go along. But first, let me just say a few words about what I think theory is. The key point you want to understand is we live in an incredibly complicated world, and trying to make sense of the world that we live in is remarkably difficult. And the only way that you can make sense of the world is with theories. Theories are simplifications of reality. Sometimes students will say to me, I want to come up with a simple theory, to which I reply, all theories are simple, so you don't need that adjective, simple. Theories are simplifications of reality. Basically, you recognize the fact that there are lots of factors that are at play in influencing events. But what you're doing is you're taking a number of those factors and throwing them on the cutting room floor, and you're relying on one or two factors to underpin how you think about the world. You're simplifying, right? What this tells you is that theories are sometimes going to be wrong, even realist theories. There is no theory that is right all the time, because sometimes those factors that you leave on the cutting room floor jump up and bite you in the hiney. To give you an example of this, Steve Walt and I, who are both card-carrying realists, wrote this book called The Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy. And lots of people over the years have delighted in pointing out in a gotcha moment that the Israel Lobby book contradicts our realist theory, because the Israel Lobby book says that domestic politics causes the United States to act in non-strategic ways. This is what the Lobby book says. It says the United States, when it comes to Israel, is not behaving the way a realist would expect American policymakers to behave. It's because of the lobby, domestic politics. And people expect us, when they level that charge at us, to be defensive and say, oh no, the lobby book really fits in with their theory. But our response is, you're absolutely correct. The Israel lobby book contradicts my basic theory of international politics. And the same thing is true with Steve. And that's because domestic politics is on the cutting room floor in my theory. You all understand that. Domestic politics does not matter in John's theory. Am I saying domestic politics never matters in the real world? No, I'd be crazy to say that. I'm just saying it doesn't matter that much. And in most cases, when it does matter, it doesn't matter very much. For me, what matters are a handful of structural factors. And those structural factors can tell you a lot about how the world works, but they can't tell you everything. So it's just very important to understand that you, all of you, need theories to make sense of the world. Whether you're talking about raising children and the theories that you have in your head for how you discipline your children when they misbehave, or whether you're talking about running Greek foreign policy or American foreign policy, you can't make decisions in terms of how to think about the world without a theory in your head. Just to give you one example of this, when China was rising in the 1990s and into the 2000s, I said that the United States should not facilitate China's rise. It was a huge mistake. You're going to create a peer competitor. You want to keep China as weak as possible. This is realism 101. But the United States of America was dominated by liberals. The foreign policy establishment was, and they had a series of liberal theories that they employed for thinking about China. Their idea was that if you get China hooked on capitalism and you integrate them into the global economy and you facilitate economic interdependence, we'll have no problem at all. Furthermore, if you integrate them into international institutions, they will become, in Robert Zoellick's famous terminology, responsible stakeholders. And once they become responsible stakeholders, and once they're hooked on capitalism, as happened with the Asian tigers, will happen with China. It will become a liberal democracy. And once it's a liberal democracy, it will be no problem for Japan or the United States because they're liberal democracies. And as you all know, liberal democracies never fight each other in the liberal story. That's their story. So it's very important to understand that the policy of engagement toward China was based on the three principal liberal theories. And the critics of liberal hegemony, and there were not many of them, were people like me who were realists, who said that whether China is a democracy or not doesn't matter. If it becomes powerful, it's going to have a big appetite. And in my mind, it's going to want to dominate East Asia the way we dominate the Western Hemisphere. They'd be nuts not to want to dominate East Asia. They want to be really powerful. They remember what happened the last time they were weak. It's called the century of national humiliation, right? So from a realist point of view, I was opposed. And by the way, just to go to NATO expansion, the realists, George Kennan being the most famous example, argued that NATO expansion was a ridiculous and foolish move, and it was going to end up causing a huge crisis with the Soviet Union / Russia, and we should not expand NATO. But there's a whole set of liberal theories, I'm not going to go into this now, that underpinned our expansion of NATO eastward. They who were in charge, this is the Clinton administration to start, then the Bush administration, the Obama administration, they believed that NATO expansion was not going to lead to disaster because they had these liberal theories. Realists disagreed. The only point I'm trying to make to you here is that you want to understand that there is no way you can formulate foreign policy. There's no way you can think intelligently about foreign policy without a theory in your head. But as my discussion points out, and you surely have all figured this out, what you see is there are competing theories in international politics. And of course, what he wanted me to do is talk about the virtues of realism, which I'll do in a minute. But you all understand that realism is a hard sell. It was especially a hard sell during the unipolar moment. Convincing people that NATO expansion was bad, that was difficult. Convincing people that engagement with China, that helping China to get rich made no sense, is an argument that was almost impossible to make. And I'll say more about this as I go along. But we live in a world where theory is God. And when you go to Washington or you come to a place like Athens and you talk to policymakers and they diss theory, they, in fact, in practice, use theories to think about the world. You have no choice, and you have no choice because the world is so complicated that you can't make sense of it and you can't make decisions unless you have theories in your head. Second set of points. I think that realism provides the best explanation for how the world works. It's better than the liberal theories. This is not to say that it always works, right? Again, no theory is right all the time. I always tell students, if you hear somebody say, I have a theory that is right all the time, you want to dismiss that argument because what it really means is that person doesn't have a theory. You can't be right all the time. But realism does a really good job of explaining how the world works. If somebody said to any of you, what you have to do is go back to 1800 and ramp forward to the present, 1800 to 2026, okay? 226 years. And I want you to pick out a theory that can explain how the world works over that time frame. This would mean 1, the Napoleonic Wars, 2, World War I, 3, World War II, 4, the Cold War, 5, the rise of China, and then it would involve unification of Germany. Bismarck, as you know, becomes chancellor in 1862. First war is against Denmark in 1864, then against Austria in 1866, then against France in 1870. But then he stops expanding and he goes to great lengths to establish this structure of alliances in Europe. I mean, how are you going to explain all those events, all those big events that I started with, German behavior, or it was actually Prussian behavior to start with in 1862? How are you going to explain the absence of presence of war in particular periods? For example, from 1815 to 1853, which is when the Crimean War starts, you had no great power war in Europe. What explains that? Are you going to use democratic peace theory? Not close. You couldn't even get to first base, as we'd say in the United States, using democratic peace theory. There were hardly any democracies back then, and democratic peace theory tells you very little. Economic interdependence, not really. I think if you're looking for an alternative theory, the best alternative theory would be ideology. I think ideology mattered in some conflicts. I think, for example, if you're talking about Nazi Germany versus the Soviet Union, ideology really matters. But World War I, Imperial Germany versus the Triple Entente, France, Britain, and Russia, does ideology tell you much? Not at all. Maybe the Cold War is another example. Communism versus capitalism / democracy. Again, maybe World War II, but not World War I. Bismarck, not much. Ideology occasionally pops up. It tells you some things, but I think that's the best alternative to realism. I think realism is just a very effective strategy for describing the historical record. And by the way, this is how you measure how good a theory is. Most people measure how good a theory is because of its normative value, what they really want to believe. I have lots of friends who don't like my views on realism because they're liberals, and in their heart of hearts, They just don't want to admit that the world works the way I say it does. We've got to find a better way to do business, right? That's the argument. Uh, and what you do is you come up with a normative theory, but we're not interested in normative theories. We're interested in explanatory theories. We're interested in theories that explain the world, explain how the world works, because if you don't have a theory that explains how the world works, you don't have a theory that you can use to make policy decisions. So you need a theory that actually explains the world. And one of the problems with realism, especially my variant of realism, is that it presents a very dark picture. And people don't like that. They don't like that dark picture. I don't like it either. I'm basically a liberal. I think it's tragic. My book is called The Tragedy of Great Power Politics. I think it's tragic that the world operates the way the world does operate. But I'm a realist with a little r as well as a realist with a capital R. And you have to accept the way the world works and operate around that simple fact of life. People find that very hard to do. But I think that realism, despite the fact it tells a bleak story, a story of tragedy, is a very powerful theory, and therefore one that people should pay great attention to. Now, why do I say that? What is it about realism that makes it such a powerful theory and so hard to defeat intellectually? And I do believe my argument, this is a self-serving statement, but I do believe my argument is hard to defeat intellectually. So what I want to do is I want to lay out my theory for you, and then I want to compare it to economic interdependence theory, and I want to also compare it to how most economists think about the world and show you the difference and show you why my theory is the most powerful theory of the three. As you know, I basically start with a handful of simple assumptions about the world. And of great importance is my assumption that we live in a world where there's no higher authority, number one. Number two, where states have some offensive military capability. It obviously varies from case to case, but you live in a world where states are the principal actors. There's no higher authority. You all know this is the anarchy argument. The system is not hierarchic. There's no higher authority. It's anarchic. And all those states that are in the system have some offensive capability. Some have more than others. And then third, and this is of enormous importance, you can never know the intentions of other states, right? When I was in the military back in the day, I was in intelligence. I worked in Air Force intelligence, and we cared greatly about assessing the Soviet threat. And you always looked at two dimensions of the Soviet threat. One was capabilities, and two were intentions. We actually were very good at measuring Soviet capabilities. We could tell how many SS-18s they had, how many Foxbat aircraft, how many armored division equivalents in Central Europe, and so forth and so on. Because material capabilities are things that you can see and count. You can just count armored divisions, you can count submarines. Intentions are in the heads of individuals, and you can't see them. They're just very hard to know. They could also change overnight, right? Very hard to tell. So even if you can tell what intentions are today of a particular country, you can't tell for sure what they're going to be in 5 years, 10 years. Intentions are very difficult to discern, right? And what that means is you tend to assume worst case about intentions if you can't know, right? Or you look to their capabilities. Right? You look to their capabilities. Just to give you an example on this, the Chinese, and Deng Xiaoping was the key player here, said, what you want to do is you want to grow the Chinese economy, you can grow Chinese military forces, but you want to talk peace, love, and dope. You don't want to talk in harsh ways. You don't want to engage in wolf warrior diplomacy because you'll scare the United States and other countries like Japan. My response to that was, it doesn't matter whether you talk in wolf warrior diplomacy terms or not. All the United States will care about is how powerful you are economically. Because once the United States sees you growing economically, they'll know, number one, you can translate that economic might into military might. Remember, economic might is the foundation of military might. You see China growing economically, you can know that they can develop formidable offensive forces, and intentions are not going to matter. And what Deng Xiaoping was saying, you can convey benign intentions, but you can't convey benign intentions because we can't know what China's intentions are today, and we certainly can't know what they are in the future. So what we rivet on are their capabilities. Just to go back to the Cold War, we were, as I said, very good at figuring out what Soviet capabilities look like. We could never agree on Soviet intentions. There was huge disagreement inside and outside of the intelligence community about what Soviet intentions were. So the point that I'm making to you, first three assumptions I start with: anarchy, no higher authority, one. Two, all states have some offensive capability. And number three, you can never be certain about the intentions of other states. The fourth assumption, and this is going to be very important for what I say moving forward, the fourth assumption is that the principal goal of states is survival. You want to survive. For all the obvious reasons, that has to be your number one goal. You can't pursue any other goal if you don't survive. And then the fifth assumption is that states are basically rational actors, strategic calculators. Those are the five assumptions of realism that I start with. And my argument is when you mix those assumptions up, right, you mix those assumptions up, you get a very nasty and brutish world. Why is that the case? First of all, you run the risk that another state will have malign intentions and lots of offensive capability. You run the risk that if Germany rearms in the 1930s, it will turn into Nazi Germany. You just never know. You help China to grow into a really powerful state. As I said, this big new Brzezinski, when I debated him on this issue, can you tell me what China's intentions are going to be in 20 or 30 years? You can't even tell me who's going to be in charge in China. You're going to build up the power of a state, turn it into an offensive juggernaut, and you can't be certain what its intentions are? From a realist point of view, this is crazy, right? I would never do this, but this is what we did, right? So what I'm saying to you is the great danger that you run into is there's a state that has malign intentions and a state that has a lot of offensive capability. Second problem is, second cause of fear, a key word in Thucydides, a key word in Hobbes, a key word in my lexicon. Why do you get fear? Because if you get into trouble, there's no higher authority that can pull your chestnuts out of the fire, right? You're in an anarchic system. You're in an anarchic system where he gets powerful and he turns out to have malign intentions, and I dial 911, as we say in the United States, there's nobody at the other end. So then the question is, what's the best way to survive in that system? The best way to survive is to be really powerful. The best way to survive is to be a regional hegemon, like the United States is in the Western Hemisphere. Do you think we go to bed at night in the Western Hemisphere worrying about any country attacking us in our region of the world? Absolutely not. We are by far the most powerful state in the Western Hemisphere. We have fish to the west of us, fish to the east of us, Canada to the north of us, and Mexico to the south of us. And then further south, you run into weak countries like Guatemala and Bolivia, and even Argentina and Brazil. There's no country that can challenge us from a security point of view. This is an ideal situation. The point is, you want to be really powerful. I say with regard to the Chinese would be out of their mind if they didn't try to dominate East Asia. They should want to take Taiwan. They should want to dominate the South China Sea. They should want to dominate the East China Sea. They should want to make sure they are far more powerful than Japan than they have been in the past. Why? Because that's the best way to survive. There's the key word. It's the best way to survive. You all understand that what happened in the middle of the 19th century when the Europeans and then later the Americans came to Asia, that Japan imitated the European countries and the United States, and Japan became a great power. The Chinese failed to imitate. There's a whole literature on this, why China failed to become a powerful state in the middle of the 19th century forward, and why Japan, starting with the Meiji Restoration in 1868, did. But you know what the price that China paid for not imitating the European states is called? The century of national humiliation. Talk to the Chinese about the century of national humiliation. Late 1840s to the late 1940s. This is what happens when you're weak in international politics. You Greeks really sense that, I'm sure. I bet every one of you wishes that Greece was about 100 times more powerful than it is, and for good strategic reasons. You don't want to be weak in international politics. You have lots of neighbors that make you very nervous. And over time, you've had lots and lots of neighbors who have made you very nervous, and some of them have done terrible things to you. You've disappeared from the map on a number of occasions. That doesn't happen when you're really powerful. That doesn't happen when you're a regional hegemon. So my point is that if you're interested in survival, right, and you're in an anarchic system where you cannot know intentions, right, and where you're going to end up fearing other states, and where you understand it's a self-help system, right? It's a self-help system. Again, there's no higher authority. As my mother used to say to me when I was a little boy, God helps those who help themselves. That's a self-help system. That's what we're talking about in international politics. Taking care of yourself, right? And what this means, right, what this means is that you want to dominate your region of the world the way the United States dominates its region of the world, and you want to make sure nobody else dominates its region of the world. And let me just say a word or two about that. Most of you have probably never wondered why the United States wanders all over the planet, sticking its nose in everybody's business, building bases here, bases there, bases everywhere. You know, why do we do that? It's because we are free to roam around the planet. And the reason we are free to roam around the planet is we have no threats in our own backyard. I cannot emphasize this enough. The United States is a regional hegemon, and that frees it up to roam into other areas of the world, including Europe, including East Asia. Well, what the United States fears with China is that if China becomes a regional hegemon, it is then free to roam into the Western Hemisphere. And we all remember the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Soviets were not even a regional hegemon in Europe because we prevented that from happening. But nevertheless, they were interested in roaming into the Western Hemisphere, and this did not make us happy. We do not want anybody roaming into the Western Hemisphere. And by the way, you understand the Chinese today are not happy about the fact that we are in their face in East Asia, that we are in East Asia with large-scale military forces, that we run up and down the Chinese coastline in East Asia. They do not like that at all. I don't blame them. We have a Monroe Doctrine. The same Monroe Doctrine logic should apply to them. And for those of you in the audience who don't think that NATO expansion into Ukraine was a threat to Russia, you should think about the fact that Ukraine is Russia's backyard, just like the Western Hemisphere is our backyard. And we don't like distant great powers coming into our backyard. Why do you think the Soviets should not be apoplectic about the thought of the United States of America moving right onto its doorstep and moving American forces and American weaponry into Ukraine? It's the same basic logic. Of course, this is why realists like me oppose NATO expansion. We said, do you seriously think the Russians are going to tolerate us moving right up to their border? I don't think so. right? But anyway, the point I want to make to you is you want to be a regional hegemon. You want to be really powerful, and you want to make sure that there is no other regional hegemon on the planet. And this logic is going to underpin the US-China competition moving forward. So that's my basic realist story. And I think if you take that logic that I laid out and you apply it to the historical record, and I'm choosing my words carefully here, I think it does a good job. It does a good job of explaining a great deal of what's happened in the past. It does not do a perfect job. There are cases that don't fit with my theory, which is very important you understand that. Theory is an imperfect instrument, but it's the best instrument we have for making sense of the world and therefore making policies. But I think realism, that structural realist variant that I laid out to you, I think actually does a quite good job explaining how the world works. Now, I want to go to economic interdependence theory and talk about that, and I want to compare it to my realist theory and tell you why I think it is not as good a theory. It's not to say that economic interdependence theory cannot explain anything. It's not to say it's totally useless. I'm not making that argument. I'm just making the argument that it is not nearly as powerful an argument as realism. And I'm going to explain why, and I'm going to do it on the basis of two words. But before I get to those two words, one of which I've talked about already, I want to tell you a bit more about economic interdependence theory. I wrote Tragedy of Great Power Politics in 2001. Shortly thereafter, I went to China for the first time. And I've been to China many times, and I found almost immediately that I was something of a rock star in China. And this was despite the fact I was making the argument that China cannot rise peacefully and that the United States should do everything it can to slow down Chinese economic growth. And nevertheless, I constantly got invited back to China, and everywhere I went to speak, I faced huge audiences. And many people who I talked to would try to refute my argument. I once asked the Chinese why they kept inviting me back since I was making the argument that China cannot rise peacefully. And one of the arguments, which I always found quite amusing, was they said, "You're the first American we've met who admits that the United States is ruthless." Because, my argument is that all great powers are ruthless, including the United States. And they were used to having all these liberal Americans come over and tell the Chinese that we're a benign hegemon. I'm sure some of you in the audience believe this. And I told them that that was nonsense. The United States is not a benign hegemon. If you're an ally of the United States, most of the time we treat you quite well. But the United States is a ruthless great power. And the Chinese liked hearing that. But the second reason that the Chinese were very interested in talking to me, and the most important reason, is they said they wanted to figure out how they could defeat my argument, right? And basically they said, this is a very powerful argument, Professor Mearsheimer. We accept that you have a powerful argument, but we want to figure out how to defeat your argument. And anyway, the argument that they invariably turned to was economic interdependence theory, right? And let me just say a word about that. I think of the liberal theories, the most powerful of the three liberal theories is democratic peace theory. I don't think it is as powerful as realism, but I think democratic peace theory is the most powerful of the liberal theories. The Chinese could not turn to democratic peace theory because they did not intend to become a democracy, right? The argument, as you all know, is that democracies don't fight other democracies. And China was not a democracy and not planning to become a democracy. And therefore, they were not going to use that theory against me. So they went to economic interdependence theory. And this is the argument that they made. We are hooked on capitalism, just like you. We have been integrated into this global international economic order that you created during the Cold War and have expanded now in the unipolar moment. And we're part of it, and we are getting very rich. And you, the United States, are also getting very rich, and Japan is getting very rich. Everybody's getting very rich. And who would slay the goose that lays the golden egg or golden eggs? That was the argument, right? If you strip away all the layers of the onion, basically what they were saying is that prosperity is of enormous importance to all of these states. And that achieving prosperity would guarantee that you didn't have any major crises or any wars among the great powers. And here we're talking, of course, about China and Russia, so that China could rise and the United States could rise. Just to come at this from the American point of view, when John the realist would say to American liberals that China is getting more and more prosperous and it could turn that economic might into military might, their argument is that's not going to happen, and who cares if they're getting more prosperous or wealthier relative to us over time, right? Because we're getting wealthy too, right? Everybody's getting rich. This is a wonderful gig we have here, right? Who cares whether the Chinese are getting richer than we are? It doesn't matter. From my point of view, as somebody who cares about the balance of power, it matters enormously, but it didn't matter for them because everybody's getting prosperous. And in the liberal story, which Americans believed, hook, line, and sinker, because of the importance of prosperity, you'd have no war between the United States and China. You see the argument here? Now, what's the difference between realism and economic interdependence theory? Two words. Survival sits at the heart of my argument, and prosperity sits at the heart of their argument. And in a world where survival is your principal goal, and you are worried about the balance of power, you will behave in aggressive ways that do not apply in a world where prosperity is your principal goal. Okay? Just want to understand the distinction here between prosperity, which is the core causal mechanism in economic interdependence theory, and survival, which is the core causal mechanism in realism. To give you one example quickly to illustrate this, the period in Europe here before 1914. As many of you, I'm sure, know, there was a huge amount of economic interdependence in Europe before 1914. There really was. And it involved all countries. At the same time, there was an intense security competition that revolved around two alliances, the Triple Entente and the Triple Alliance. Triple Entente, of course, is France, Britain, and Russia. The Triple Alliance is Austria-Hungary, and Imperial Germany, and Italy, right? And you had this intense security competition, which leads to the July crisis in 1914, and ultimately on August 1st, 1914, to World War I. And this is all happening in a world where there is a huge amount of economic interdependence and everybody's getting prosperous. What happened here? Survival considerations trumped prosperity. I believe that World War I was basically a preventive war started by Germany, and Germany was scared stiff that the balance of power was shifting against Germany. The Russians, who had been defeated in the Russo-Japanese War in 1904 and 1905, were coming back from the dead. The French and the British were doing all sorts of things to prepare for a possible war. The Germans thought that the balance of power was shifting against them. They saw a window of opportunity. They launched a preventive war. That's my view. It's a security argument. Putin going into Ukraine, that's a preventive war. It's a preventive war, right? Security, survival, right? You never can underestimate the extent to which survival, the, the idea that survival is of the utmost importance. You see this in Hobbes, by the way. It's very clear. That's the one natural law in Hobbes, that every person should seek to survive, right? It's of enormous importance, right? So it's survival that trumps prosperity. Now, let me conclude by just talking about economists and how economists think about the world, okay? And contrast that with how realists like me think about the world. And I want you to keep in mind as I move forward here that there is some overlap between economic interdependence theory and how economists tend to think about the world. For the most part, economists in the West since 1945 have paid very little attention to geopolitics. Very little attention to geopolitics. If you think in terms of two variables, here's geopolitics and here's economics or the business world. Those were, in very important ways, two different worlds. Now, why do I say that? For those of us in the room who are old enough to remember the Cold War, right, there was obviously a profound geopolitical competition between the United States and the Soviet Union, and the United States and its allies, and the Soviet Union and its allies. But there was actually remarkably little economic intercourse. You know, people talk about the liberal international order that was created in 1945. It was not an international order. That order that was created that involved things like the IMF, the World Bank, the European Coal and Steel Community, and so forth and so on, which became the EC, then became the EU. All those institutions that were created in the West. The Soviet Union had their own set of institutions. They had their own order, okay? And there was remarkably little economic interaction between the two orders. This meant that geopolitics and economic considerations, business considerations, were not intertwined. Then comes the unipolar moment. And in the unipolar moment, there's only one great power, the United States of America. So there's no geopolitics. You all understand that? There's no geopolitics during the unipolar moment. There's no great power politics. There's only one great power. You can't have great power politics if you have only one great power. So the business world that you grew up in, most of you in the audience came of age in, unipolar moment starting in 1992, after the Soviet Union collapses, December 1991. The unipolar moment, which most of you grew up in, was a world in which geopolitics hardly mattered at all. And therefore, there was no discussion of how the business community, how the economic world and the security world interacted with each other, just as was the case for different reasons in the Cold War. Then in 2017, the unipolar moment ends and we move into multipolarity. We have three great powers, and economic considerations and security considerations are intertwined in ways that we've never seen before. It's very important to understand that. Economics really matters. You all understand we, the United States, are in an intense security competition with China that has a military dimension for sure, but also has an economic dimension involving sophisticated technologies. We pay enormous attention these days to supply chains and so forth and so on. So economics and geopolitics are inextricably bound up for the first time. So the question you have to ask yourself is, what happens in the world that we now live in when economic considerations clash with security considerations? With those logics that are developed in economics departments where they pay virtually no attention to security. Do you think people in economics departments think about anarchy and survival and the balance of power? They do not. It's not part of their lexicon. That's part of the realist lexicon. What they're concerned with is generating prosperity. That's how economists think about the world. What can we do to fix the system in ways that generate prosperity for everyone? And economists don't care whether China is growing faster than the United States is. Realists certainly do, but economists don't. Because economists, like people who do political economy or economic interdependence theory, those people focus on prosperity. Economists are interested in prosperity. Realists are interested in survival. So the point I'm making to you, this will be my final point, is that moving forward, I am not arguing that economic interdependence theory is useless or that the theories that economists bring to bear in terms of thinking about how the international economy functions are useless. Not my argument at all. My point is that when those economic theories or economic interdependence theory clashes with realist logic will win almost every time. And the main reason is because survival in an anarchic system where you cannot know the intentions of other states that may be very powerful forces you to behave in aggressive ways that have no place in those liberal theories like economic interdependence or the liberal theories that dominate in the economics profession. Thank you.